Sawadee krap. My name is Imtiaz Muqbil. I am the executive editor of Travel Impact Newswire based in Bangkok. I have been covering the Asia Pacific travel and tourism industry since 1981. My detailed notes, research, reports and columns over the last 40 years are now being compiled into an unmatched history of travel and tourism, which I am sharing free so that future generations may learn the lessons of history, replicate our successes and avoid repeating past mistakes. This lecture, part of the ongoing Power of History series, will continue to focus on the role and responsibilities of brand name corporate CEOs in rebalancing travel and tourism in the post-COVID era. A popular management cliche refers to game-changing events. The game today remains the same. Travel and tourism will return after the COVID era and return robustly. There will always be hosts and guests. People will always need hotels, airports, airlines, and various other infrastructure and services. But in the era to come, it will be more important to change the tune rather than change the game. Let me begin with this interview with Accor CEO Sébastien Bazin, published on the IHIF website on the 12th of December 2021. Please pause the recording and read his powerful statement. He says that for the first time since taking the helm, having dealt with the twists and turns of the pandemic, he felt he was no longer in control of anything. What was his solution? As the pandemic raged, with no idea what tomorrow would bring, he let the people on the ground make the decisions because they knew the local situations. In other words, it was each hotel for itself. Elsewhere in the same interview, he said the experience humbled him. Here's another flashback. The famous CEO of AirAsia, otherwise a very flamboyant and cocksure character, he was also devastated by an event outside his control, a 2014 air crash which killed about 150 people. His words, "I never believed it would happen," then followed by another revelation. He ignored the advice of his highly paid lawyers and did the right thing, visiting the family members and the staff in an act of humane compassion, sympathy and condolence. Every day, CEOs have to deal with situations both within and outside their control. However, some of them make really bad calls. Like this lot. And this gentleman. Increasingly, research suggests that celebrity CEOs do their firms harm in the long run by becoming ingrained in the behaviors and waves of thinking that made them famous, blinding them to changing market and internal conditions. In other words, they can become victims of their own egos and bluster. I would argue that they harm not just their firms, but their world at large. The world today is politically polarized, socially and culturally divided, economically in disarray, technologically chaotic, and environmentally devastated. Who should take responsibility for this state of affairs? CEOs play a very important role in shaping both the agenda and the dialogue. All industry forums pride themselves on how many CEOs they can attract. The assumption is that if you are a CEO, you are some kind of an omniscient figure who has the answers to every whatever issue is being discussed. I have been listening to CEOs all through my nearly 50 years in journalism and 41 years in travel journalism. And I often ask myself, if these guys are so smart, why is the world in such a mess? Let's take a look at the two categories of CEOs today. One is the older outgoing generation. This lineup of executives was the so-called future generation of yesterday. The mess today did not happen overnight. If the world is in a mess today, the outgoing generation certainly bear a lot of responsibility. Maybe they did not stand up for the courage of their convictions to stop many of the damaging trends of the past. So if all these people were futurists, visionaries and thought leaders of the past, clearly they failed their mandate. The second category of leaders is the so-called future generation. This generation is inheriting a bigger mess than ever. They are now in a completely new era. They claim to see opportunities but I don't see too many of them talking about the hazards, risks, and threats of the chaos which prevails today. What do they know about the history of previous crises? So, just as this generation landed up inheriting the mess created by the outgoing generation, their children will inherit the mess they will leave behind. But even as one game changes, another remains the same. The job of a CEO has not changed. They still have to protect the interests of their owners, shareholders, guests, and employees. And when they appear in public forums, they usually like to talk about their products and services, their companies, and themselves, perhaps not necessarily in that order. And what do they not like to talk about? That too has not changed. They will steer clear of controversial issues and certainly avoid discussing their own mistakes. And yes, they are never at a loss of words to attack government officials, political leaders, and others in public service for inefficiency, inaction, tax burdens, and imposing restrictions on doing business activities. Now, as we look into the post-COVID era, there is a lot of talk about the good days to come. Wonderful things that can be done by artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and much more. These same promises were being made 30 years ago after the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War, that the world is heading for an era of political and economic freedoms based on democracy, open markets, globalization, liberalization, deregulation, privatization, etc., etc. That did not happen. The World Travel and Tourism Council, one of the most powerful travel institutions of the 1990s, was born with the idea of creating jobs. In 1996, it announced plans to create 100 million jobs in 10 years. Today, it is trying to save those same 100 million jobs. So while the world will always need CEOs, believing all their bluster is probably not a good idea. Clearly, the CEOs themselves need to start changing their tune if they genuinely want to create a better future for their children and grandchildren. Before changing the tune, however, it may be necessary to change the venue where the music is being performed. Rock concerts and violin concertos both require entirely different venues. Similarly, travel and tourism functions best if the operating environment is right. CEOs cannot stop volcanoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, pandemics, or plane crashes, but they certainly can stop political leaders from disturbing the peace by starting wars, waging genocide, trampling on human rights, sowing religious and ethnic discord amongst people. Sometimes the musicians need to be changed. That process is well underway. The profile of CEOs is already changing with one of the most important trends of our time, gender equality, and more women in senior management roles. Finally, it may be necessary to change both the music and the lyrics. This is what I will discuss in my lecture next week. Thank you for watching. If this lecture gave you food for thought, please click like and subscribe to the Travel Impact Newswire channel. You can access this and all my earlier tune-changing YouTube lectures on my website at the link on the screen. Academics, consultants, and anyone else who uses any of the material, please kindly have the professional courtesy to give credit. Thank you and Sawadee Krap.